My name is Jessica Brinkley, and I will be serving as your moderator for this evening's webinar. Tonight's presentation is brought to you by the NEA Center for Great Public Schools ESC Quality Department in collaboration with the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. I would like to give a special thanks to Dr. Thomas Demaria, who will be joining us this evening, as well as my colleagues who are helping this webinar run smoothly in the background. The ESC Quality Department represents and advocates for nearly 500,000 education support professional members, also referred to as ESP, across the country. Our strategic focus is to elevate ESP careers by developing, implementing, and promoting best practices and policies that enhance ESP effectiveness and meet the needs of the whole student. We provide the tools and programs as well as resources to ensure that ESP become empowered leaders, accomplished professionals, and members of a high-quality education workforce. Tonight's session, Supporting Children Suffering from the Absence of Their Parents. This session will discuss support from parents and caregivers and how vital it is as a component in a child's development. Many children suffer because of the temporary absence and or permanent loss of a stable adult influence in their lives. And this loss can be caused by a variety of factors, including incarceration, mental illness, substance abuse, and death. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Thomas Demaria from the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. It will discuss how children come to understand and adjust to real and ambiguous losses and offer practical suggestions on how education support professionals can create a school climate where children are able to talk about their losses and receive needed support. The free resources developed by the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, of which NEA is a founding organizational member, will be highlighted in this session. At this time, I would like to introduce to you our presenter for tonight's webinar. Dr. Thomas Demaria is a licensed psychologist and a fellow of the Trauma Division of the American Psychological Association. He's the director of the Psychological Services Center of the Doctoral Psychology Program at Long Island University, host and founder of the Graduate Student Trauma Response Team, which was awarded the Innovation Program Award from the National Council of Schools of Professional Psychology. He was a co-recipient of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, Sarah Haley Award for Clinical Excellence for his clinical work with World Trade Center families and 911 first responders, and later earned an ISTSS Distinguished Mentor Award for his teaching of students in the field of trauma. He currently serves on the Professional Advisory Board for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, and is involved in training initiatives for the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. Dr. Demaria has earned numerous awards for leading hundreds of community disasters, counseling responses during the past 30 years, and served as a volunteer for the Greater New York and Nassau County Red Cross and Salvation Army. He's provided guidance during the planning of the National 9/11 Memorial Museum, is a two-time recipient of the prestigious New York State Liberty Award for Community Service in New York following the World Trade Center terrorist attacks, and in the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Katrina, and winner of a humanitarian award by the Center for Christian and Jewish Studies for his work with Holocaust survivors. Demaria was co-recipient of the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, as I mentioned. Recently, Dr. Demaria co-authored with Dr. Schoenfeld the Child and Disaster and Bereavement Practice Guidelines for the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's with great pleasure that I welcome this evening Dr. Thomas Demaria.
Thank you so much. And what I'd like to do first is thank all of you for caring so much about the children that you have contact with and work with to learn more about the loss and what you can do to help them with the many losses they experience. I'm joined today by one of my superb doctoral psychology students, Loie Bromberg, who will give part of the presentation tonight, and I think you'll appreciate hearing from her. What I wanted to do is back up before we start talking about what you can do, is kind of understand more about loss and what it is and what it's not. And one of the mistakes that people make is that we think that only a certain small percentage of children go through loss. And really loss due to change and growth is pretty common in the lives of children. Children lose friendships. Sometimes families move, so they lose their house and they go to a new neighborhood. They lose teachers and school staff every year because they move up in grade. It's a natural, happy change for them. They lose coaches because they get to be at a different level of their athletic expertise. They change teams, so they have a loss there. They change schools as they move up. They change clothes, with not only with styles, but they wear some clothes out. And all of us as parents know that games and toys get pretty much old hat pretty soon, and they lose those too. So one thing I'd like to start off with is loss affects everybody, and it's something that's a natural phenomenon, and it's something that if we accept it as natural, we won't be as afraid to talk about it. And it's a healthy thing too, and we'll talk about loss and resilience too. Now, losses for us adults are also common. We have temporary loss. We lose our car keys. We lose things. Our memory is not as strong maybe when you were younger. We reach a new phase of being an adult. We lose some of our freedom. When we have kids or we have other responsibilities, we start to lose that. And we also have desired losses. We have our desire to lose weight or desire to do something that we want losses to happen, or losing stress, for example. We want to lose that. So again, loss is such a common part of the human experience, but again, it's been long neglected, and oftentimes we forget that loss involves some grief, and if it's a natural phenomenon, which is what loss is about, so grief will be also natural too. Now, backing up, we learn about loss beginning at the age of 6 and 12 months of age. Children began to understand separation and loss. Parents and everybody in the audience listening knows that children learn the game peekaboo, where the parent will cover up their face, and for a minute the child begins to understand that the parent's maybe not there anymore, and when the parent shows their face again to the child, suddenly the separation is ended, and you can see the joyful look on the child's face. It's a game that's played almost universally around the world, and it's a game that helps children begin to know that despite the fact that mommy or daddy may be missing, mommy and daddy come back, that we understand that separation and loss is not something that they should be afraid of. Some children may continue to have separation anxiety, for example, but over time, kids begin to realize that mommy will reappear or daddy will reappear. And that's just a normal phenomenon. So one way children learn about loss is to accept the fact that daddy and mommy will come back and that daddy and mommy will be back in their lives. Loss because of death, sadly, is also common in the lives of children. About 5% will face the death of a parent by age 16. Really a startling number considering how many children that you'll face in schools and in the classroom because of this. And almost all children experience the death of an important person in their lives. Particularly before 18, most people will have suffered the loss of a significant family member. Most children will have lost a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, and somebody in more immediate family. So it's likely that you work with grieving children every day, even if you don't see any children who appear to be grieving. Again, loss because of death is even common too, compared to just other losses. Now, there's different types of ways of talking about losses. Obviously, when someone loses a family member, a close friend, or a loved one, we see that as a definitive loss. They've lost somebody in their life who's died. We also have things that come with those primary losses, things such as relationships. Losing a dad or mom means that that special time you had with that parent is not going to be there in the future. Losing schools, oftentimes because of a parent death, children have to move to live with grandma or grandparent or someone else. Family finances oftentimes change dramatically following a death, and oftentimes the family's quality of life is compromised and lifestyle. So after the primary loss, the death of the person, it's not the only loss the child's going to experience. Again, kids go through loss all the time, but these losses sometimes will be compounded by the secondary losses that happen after a parent or a loved one in their family dies. The other type of losses that is often talked about is something called cumulative loss. And that results in following the number of successive losses experienced by the child over time. It's so sad in certain neighborhoods and in certain parts of the world where children lose people again and again because of violence, because of poverty, because of other situations where people just keep coming in and out of their lives and sadly dying often. And this can result in a suspension of the child's ability to ever really start to grieve, because just when they start to grieve for one situation, there's another loss compounding that. Now, again, we talked about this before, but remember that secondary losses are common, and they're often subtle. So oftentimes the child who's grieving in the class doesn't really get over the losses until they start to see those secondary losses. For example, if it's during the holiday time, it's having a holiday season without someone at the table they love. It may mean that certain dishes aren't prepared because that person prepared those dishes. But it also means that for a child, it's not only the loss of their present, it could be the loss of their future. It could be the surviving parent may be less available because they're busy doing the roles of both parents. They might have lost shared memories that they had with dad and mom, that dad and mom were able to have a shared memory with their child, but when one parent goes, all those memories are gone. Children sometimes worry about their future. Without a dad or a mom, where are they going to go? Are they going to be able to be independent? Will they be able to leave, or do they have to start working to support their family? And as such, a grieving family, either due to a primary or some of these secondary losses, often lose the sense that they're special and have that special recognition and begin to become more fearful. They're fearful that their security and safety is gone because of this transition. So the change process that when a person dies can be very frightening, because that person not only was the person who gave physical support and comfort, but the person often did a lot of else beside that. So children oftentimes become more aware that there's a lot more that are going to happen, and they begin to be more and more frightened by this. So to go back a little bit, we all form attachments with our parents and our loved ones when we're very young. And because of that attachment, we learn how to regulate our emotions. We learn how to seek soothing, get support, and we also learn that if we do things, risk, we get that encouragement by our parents. Our parents, most of the times, encourage their children to grow up, be independent, learn skills, and get out of their house, learn how to deal with their feelings, cope with their feelings, whatever they were. And because of that consistent attachment support, they learn to regulate their feelings and to develop competency. The tricky thing is if the parent's out of the scene, dies, obviously one of their attachments is missing, and the surviving person in their world can also be someone who may not be able to fill in for that. And because of that, they never learn to really take risks or to get the support they need. They never really form that competency, and later on that can cause them to look for those sources, whether it's joining a gang, whether it's being in a relationship that's not too happy for them. So it's really important that schools realize that they can provide a very valuable role not by taking over the attachment, but providing that continuity, that security, and that safety, so the child can feel that there's the potential for other people who can help them learn how to take risks while getting support. So loss of attachment becomes really what grief is about, especially after a death. But there's another type of attachment that we'll talk about momentarily. Again, to go back a little bit, that attachment leads to loss if the loss is because of death, but that can make the person stronger. A lot of people that I've worked with throughout my career report that it was hard to lose a dad or mom or a brother or sister, but over time they learned to rely more on themselves, they learned about themselves, they learned about that life can be meaningful, and it really made them a changed person. So because somebody has a loss or a child has a loss at a very young age, it doesn't necessarily lead to bad outcomes. Sometimes it can lead the child to become even stronger. So I want to switch now not necessarily to attachment loss or death, but I want to talk about other losses. We talked about natural losses, but what's often forgotten is the type of grief that children experience when their parents are divorced, and when they don't see dad or mom because of custody arrangements, because of family violence, because there's orders of protection or dad or mom can't be near each other, because of military deployment, because of incarceration or jail when a parent's in jail, because of economic pressure. A lot of our families work 2, 3 jobs, are working around the clock to keep their family together. And that can often mean the parent's not there, and that can cause a lot of grief in children. Medical or mental illness, being treated for cancer, chemotherapy, can be very draining for a parent, and the child might not understand that the parent's still there even though they're sleeping all the time. Or a parent suffering from mental illness where they're in bed all the time and don't seem to interact. The other type of loss that children often experience is because of things like substance abuse, where a parent is not available because they're either drug-seeking or they're drug-engaged. Sadly, children also experience grief and loss because of immigration. They're leaving their loved ones in one place, and they're with people who are not necessarily their core family. And finally, foster care, where children are oftentimes taken from a family because of the threat or the potential for risk in that family and put someplace else. So these children are also grieving out there, and we also need to pay attention to them too. So it's important for us to see if we can figure out what are the special needs of these types of people, and I'd like to highlight a few of them. Part of it, and this is one of the main concepts that I'd like to talk about a little bit, is a concept called ambiguous loss. And ambiguous loss is really the uncertainty or lack of information about the whereabouts or status of a loved one as absent or present or dead or alive. And ambiguity freezes the grief process, so the child is torn between grieving and coping. They don't know whether the person's there or not there. And let me explain a little bit more about it. Oftentimes with ambiguous loss, there's a physical absence with the psychological presence. For example, in divorce, dad is not living in the house, but I speak to dad every so often. Or there's my birth parent's not available, but I have some contact with them. Or similar migration or immigration, that I don't see them, but I know they're still my parents. They're still out there somewhere. And the other type of ambiguous loss is physical presence with psychological absence. When a person, for example, has dementia, they're there, but they're not there. Or if a person has traumatic brain injury, or stroke, or a coma, or chronic mental illness, depression, autism, addictions, they're the person, but they're not really there for them. So the children oftentimes experience both of these types of ambiguous loss, where they're grieving, but the person's not totally gone from their lives. And it creates a lot of confusion, and it also confuses people in schools and working with the children about how to best help these children and how to both acknowledge and validate their experience so they can get the support they need and reaffirm those attachments in their life. Now, once a family experiences ambiguous loss, the family sometimes becomes isolated, as friends and family don't know what to say. If a family member is in jail, if dad's in jail, what do you say to them? How do you talk to them? So a lot of people begin to sadly back away from the family because they don't know what to do. What also happens when there's a missing parent, a family life may be confusing as members struggle to organize and reorganize roles and responsibilities because there's a lot of other people trying to help out, but there's no standard family. And family members that remain are uncertain as who is in the family system and who's performing what roles. So the family gets shaken up without this person there. Again, the person could be physically there but not psychologically there. They could be an addict, or they could be struggling with some illness, or the person could be gone, as in the case of a person who's on military deployment, who is still dad or still mom, but they're not present in the home. And the other thing that causes attenuated or a more stressful situation is the family members that remain oftentimes are so stressed out they can't be available to the children. So not only is mom or dad in jail, but the parent that's remaining, working hard, trying to keep the family up, can't really attend to the needs of that child. There's almost like a double abandonment that the children feel. Now, with ambiguous loss, like with all loss, children can be strong. And what we found in terms of the research literature is that kids can learn to attach to the psychological family. There's the biological family, there's the legal family, and there's the psychological family. And kids can adopt parents and other parents and adult figures in their lives, role models, who can really be part of this psychological family. And that can help them find that attachment that they so sorely need. Families can also grow because they learn more flexibility and tolerance for ambiguity. They learn that change is okay and it's part of the family. And as such, they can reform their identity and reconstruct family rituals and routines and become stronger. So not every family, as we mentioned before, goes through loss, and not every family struggling with ambiguous loss necessarily has bad outcomes, but it does create a little bit of a challenge for families in adapting. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some statistics that when I first read them, I was quite startled by and quite taken. And I have to admit that, you don't really, when you take a step back, appreciate this issue of children with incarcerated parents. that 52% of state inmates and 63% of federal inmates are parents to an estimated 1.7 million minor children, accounting for 2.3% of the U.S. population under the age of 18. That's a startling number of children who are suffering ambiguous loss because of parents who are incarcerated. And that's 5 million youth, or 7% of all U.S. children, experience parental incarceration at some point in their lives before reaching the age of 18. Wow, that's quite a startling number, and it speaks to the fact that how do we acknowledge that? How do we acknowledge the grief that these children, or do we don't want to shame them or embarrass them? And oftentimes that leads to greater isolation for these children. The other thing to appreciate with children who have parents who are incarcerated is many of the children experience years of trauma and disruption while the parents are engaged in the criminal activity leading to the incarceration. In addition, many of these children live in urban areas and are exposed to community violence. This is a very, very needy group, and a group of children who oftentimes are neglected and cast aside. And if we don't reach out to them, unfortunately, they'll reach out to groups that offer promises of attachment and security, but will only take advantage of them. Another group that suffers a lot of ambiguous loss are children who come from immigrant families, maybe here legally or maybe not. But just to understand their experiences, they're arriving in a country with unfamiliar customs and few close relationships because their extended family is still back in their homeland. Oftentimes they're here and they don't understand all about things. They may have seen it on television and they may be aware of it, but it's still very unfamiliar. And there's a continual worry if other family members are safe in their home country because oftentimes communication's fragmented and oftentimes they don't want to communicate because of fears of threat of being deported or identified, or if they left their home country because of potential for violence. And oftentimes these families employ ambiguous communication to minimize worry. They never really say where dad or mom is. They never really say where grandma and grandma is. So the kids are confused. Are they in their native country? Are they not here? Where are they? They do that to help the children not worry or be frightened, but all it does is it helps the children feel this ambiguous loss much more strongly. Another group that faces a lot of ambiguous loss are children from families with this military deployment. And oftentimes we forget that with these families, they have to reorganize their daily routines so they can function without the physical presence of their deployed family member. And they may feel guilt and pride to be able to function in the absence of the deployed member. And regular communication with the family because of cell phones and internet technology happens, but when that stops, it creates a lot of fear in the family, and it could be a number of reasons why the cell phones are not working. Now, the children in that family have to entertain and live with the fear of the possibility of losing a parent permanently through death, or a parent returning home because they're maimed or incapacitated because of what the war did to them. This awareness is reinforced, unfortunately, on a daily basis because of explicit media coverage of war events. And the other thing that these children often go through, although a return date from the service is often provided, it is not uncommon for the state to be changed as deployments are extended. So these children really don't have a set date when mom and dad are coming home. Kids in foster care also struggle because they don't know when they're going to see their loved ones again. Again, there's the continued psychological presence in their mind of mom and dad, but the physical absence of the parent. And oftentimes, again, they're removed from a situation where there is psychological but not physical absence because of drugs or violence, and put into situations when they must deal with both physical and psychological absence. So these children struggle a great deal. The challenge for us is to adapt what we do know of best practices of working with grieving children at any age, and to see if we can help these children who are suffering not only the direct loss of a parent, secondary losses, but also these children who have ambiguous loss, and put them into the category of grieving children also. So to back up and talk about grief in general, that most kids in a school are not going to show their grief on the outside. Oftentimes, grief is showed on the inside and only discovered if the child is asked. We can tell you from working with hundreds and hundreds of schools around the country, we can tell you that most schools say that after a loss, whether it's a loss because of death or an ambiguous loss, oftentimes it's unclear about how the child's doing because they seem to be functioning, they seem to be with their friends, and they seem to be doing okay in school. It's not just someone in the school talks to the child. that you really get a sense of the inner pain and turmoil that these poor children are going through because of their loss. And children respond in a lot of ways. Most don't show a reaction. Some know, and this is where school staff really have to be aware, they'll show it non-verbally. They'll be a little bit more angry. They'll do more risky behaviors, especially the teen years. The teachers will notice, and school staff will see, that pre-existing learning, emotional, and behavioral challenges may resurface or worsen. And it's common for children to act younger again and not be as mature or responsible as they were before they experienced the loss. Children also who grieve are going to go through loss triggers. They'll be very reactive to hearing a song or seeing a TV show that reminds them of a parent who's missing, either because of death or ambiguous loss. Special occasions, holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, etc., become grief triggers because they bring up more and more about the absence of that person. Transitions in their lives, moving to another school, and we'll talk about that more, can oftentimes cause these children to feel the absence of that parent because change causes children to become more insecure. And also things they miss out, father-daughter dances, proms, chance to have dad or mom see their good report cards. All those things are lost, and they can trigger grief reactions well after the parent is not in the family. Learning becomes also problematic, and we wonder how much of the problems we have sometimes with children who are distractible or have attention problems, it has to do really with the grief they're experiencing. Oftentimes grieving children have difficulty concentrating and they're distracted. They also have limits in learning or remembering new facts or concepts. They fail to hand in assignments or study the exams because of reduced family supervision. And their learning problems they had before only become worse, so these kids really struggle. So the place where they can get secure attachments and support becomes a place that's painful for them and shameful for them. And they begin to drift more and more to being seeing school as a negative place and a place where it only can cause sadness for them. So the question for you guys listening, is this part of my job? I'm not a mental health professional. Some of you guys may have that background, but oftentimes when we talk about schools, is it part of my job, or are there best practice or consensus guidelines I can follow? And I'm afraid of saying something wrong. And does my union, school district, administrator, professional organization support this project? And initially, when we did this work as part of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, we would face these questions all the time. So we decided to get everybody together and come up with consensus guidelines, come up with what teachers and school staff should say, and get everybody behind us. And proudly, that's how the Coalition to Support Grieving Students was founded. The NEA, if you see, is one of our founding members. So all the content of this PowerPoint that we're going to be talking about, which is also accessible on the Coalition to Support Grieving website, has been supported by these founding members, and let's make it even better, by all these other groups. These are the groups that are considered to be supporting members. They're after the founding members helped develop the curriculum. But all these groups, and it's growing every day, buy into the curriculum, buy into all the stuff you're going to learn in this webinar, and really support it. So it's neat that we all agree on something. And we estimate that the number of groups that are part of the Coalition Support Grieving Students is well upwards of 5 to 6 million school professionals. And it's growing all the time. So we have a consensus. You can say this material. The schools should be comfortable knowing that everybody's endorsing it, from superintendents to school psychologists to the NEA and other groups out there are all behind this. So it's great that you do finally have a consensus document. Now, the other barrier, besides not having a consensus document, is children may conclude that they've done something wrong by talking about the loss and avoid raising the subject again. Because what happens when kids bring up whatever grief, mom's in jail, dad's been drinking a lot, he's not around a lot, they may conclude that it's their fault. Kids blame themselves oftentimes to their parents. And they may hold in their feelings, by the way, to support their family because they don't want to create additional worry for their family. And oftentimes these kids try to look fine and reassure their family they're okay when they really need support. And part of the problem is they don't understand death and loss, and that's why this presentation hopefully will be invaluable for you guys in the audience. And oftentimes children don't want to talk because they may feel overwhelmed and they may have strong feelings. And oftentimes we as school professionals won't share our feelings with the kids, so the kids think, well, these are bad. We shouldn't really talk about them. So helping the children learn that it's okay to talk about feelings. We talk about our feelings. We're not trying to be a mental health professional. We just want to let them know that this is a safe place for them to talk about their grief. Now, Loie, my superb doctoral psychology student at LAU Post, is going to talk a little bit about initiating the conversation with children.
It's so nice to virtually be with all of you. So to talk about starting this conversation with kids, like Dr. Demaria was just saying, there are a lot of barriers to kids speaking up for themselves. They might not want to, they might not feel comfortable for a variety of reasons. So there are things that you can do as teachers to initiate the conversation for them. So one of the first things is you can express concern simply by going up to a kid and saying, hey, I'm noticing that you're not acting the same in class. I'm noticing that you are looking a little down. What's going on? Expressing that concern can be an opening for them to be able to tell you sort of what's going on the inside. Being genuine is also incredibly important. Kids are really smart, and they can tell when someone's being genuine or not. And if you show them that you're genuinely caring, you can sort of be that supportive attachment figure for them. And then they will open up to you more and have a trusting relationship. Inviting the conversation, so if you see a kid that's alone, they have a few minutes, asking them how they're doing, starting that conversation for them so that they don't have to ask for help can be really helpful. One of the other things is sort of using that third eye that you develop as teachers. Listen and observe all of your kids. Listen to, what they're saying, what they're not saying, observe their behavior, and see if anything is different. Another thing that seems a little bit potentially counterintuitive but is important is limiting personal sharing. So when, if they're going into too much detail and it's clear that they, have a lot to get off their mind, limiting how much sharing they're doing so that they are not overwhelming themselves and getting them to a supportive place. And then offering, reassurance and practical advice for those kids, offering things that they can do, things that they can do at school, and things they can do at home. And then maintaining contact is also important, so don't make it just one conversation, just a few. So some things, it's easy to fall into traps of, certain things to say and certain things that we think are helpful but aren't necessarily. So here are some examples. So the first one, I know just what you're going through. Instead, if you ask the question in sort of a questioning way, a curiosity stance where, can you tell me more about what this has been like for you? So that it, again, opens that door for that kid to tell you about their experience without you assuming what it's like for them. Another one, you must be incredibly angry. Instead, you might say something like, most people have strong feelings when something like this happens to them. What has this been like for you? Again, limiting that assumption and increasing your curiosity so that they are able to talk to you about their own experience. Another example, this is hard, but it's important to remember the good things in life too. So something you might say instead is, what kind of memories do you have about the person who's no longer with you, sort of creating that positive for them without demanding it of them. Some more examples. One is, I lost both my parents when I was your age. Again, you could say something like, tell me more about what this has been like for you. Again, helping them to open up without you telling them a little bit too much about your life and really making it about them because, they are the ones right now that are suffering. Another example is, you'll need to be strong now for your family. It's important to get a grip on your feelings. So instead saying something like, how's your family doing? What kind of concerns do you have about them? Again, you can see it's a little bit less judgmental, again, more curious, and you can learn a little bit about what's going on in their home life. Another example here is, my dog died last week. I know how you must be feeling. And instead saying something a little bit more vague but still relatable, I know how I felt when someone has not been available, but I don't really know how you're feeling. Can you tell me something about what this has been like for you? So So those are some of the ways that, how to phrase things and how to ask those questions. It's a little bit different how to act with those kids. So, like Dr. Demaria was saying, that you can observe verbal behavior from kids and also nonverbal behavior from kids. They can also observe the same from you. So how to act, being present and authentic, so making sure that you're really listening to them when they're talking to you. And in fact, listen more and talk less. So really give them the space and time to share their story without you sort of butting in and interrupting them. Avoid trying to cheer up students or their families. So things like, it'll be better, it'll be okay. Really just listen to what's going on for them, hear their pain, hear how they struggle right now. It can feel really, really supportive to them. Accept expressions of emotion. So if they start to get a little bit angry, if they start to cry, allowing them to have that safe space and reassuring them that it is a safe space for them to feel those things may be different than anybody else in their life and what they're being told in other spaces. And when they, tell you some more emotional information, showing empathy, really trying to understand their experience and understanding how hard it can be for them. On your end, don't be afraid to show emotion. So you can, share with them how hard it feels to hear what they're talking about. You can look a little bit sad. You can look a little bit sort of emotional so that they understand that, what they're saying is real and valid. And then step in to stop harmful behaviors when safety is a concern. And that, as teachers, is incredibly important.
Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the issue for you guys is oftentimes we want to share because we want to pull the kids in. A question came up about how do you limit personal sharing. And it seems like sharing about your feelings and about your experiences related to the feelings can help children feel that they don't necessarily have to compete with you. Oftentimes kids feel when adult tells them about their loss, their personal loss, the children feel that if they share their own loss, it's not going to be as big, it's not going to be as strong. So we tell them that the children should be made to feel that you've been through something similar without necessarily telling what it is, but that doesn't mean that they're going through it themselves. That in other words, you can say I went through something that was kind of like that and I felt very sad, versus my father died when I was 6. Well, the child might have lost their father when they were 9, and they might feel that wasn't as bad as the teacher, so they might shut up a little bit, or they'll start trying to take care of the teacher. So it's kind of really, very, very important that support staff and anybody in the school realize that sharing emotions, sharing you had a common experience is fine, but most of the times children get intimidated when adults try to share their experiences. Now, I'd like to also talk about this from a cultural framework in terms of cultural sensitivity. Loie?
Yeah, so remembering that the fundamental experience of grief and loss are universal. Pain is pain, and everyone experiences no matter where you're from or your background. So the most important thing is to ask questions. So asking those questions, like we were talking about before, that sense of curiosity will allow kids to open up. And asking questions about their cultural background is important so that you can understand what they're going through. And asking openly when you're unsure what would be most helpful for a family or an individual. I think some people can be afraid to ask those questions, but it's okay to say, I don't know, and I'm not really sure what that means, so can you explain more? Watch out for your own assumptions and watch out for assumptions of your fellow colleagues when you're treating these kids, and being empathic, thoughtful, and sensitive is always the key and incredibly important.
Yeah, oftentimes children report the fact that they saw somebody in a school, one of the school's support staff, cry about the loss, but then was able to put a tissue to their eye and go back to work. I think it's important for them to realize that that's okay, that they can move past the grief. They can turn it off and turn on. And remember, grief is episodic. It comes in and comes out of the child's life. It's not all the time, and they should realize that could be the same thing for adults. I think that, a point was just made about sometimes the age of the student may determine how much to share, and certainly that's based on the relationship which the support staff or the school staff knows the child with. But oftentimes we find children sometimes need to focus more on their feelings, and that's really the most important thing that we can kind of help children with. Now the question that often comes up is, what should schools do about assignments? How much should children be responsible to bring in certain things at certain times? For example, if they have to bring in money for a trip, or there's something assigned to them. And we encourage to do that more proactively, try to accept the fact that oftentimes there might not be a parent at home who's able to do a lot, or a parent who's maybe overwhelmed. So sometimes assignments, responsibilities have to be shifted, and sometimes things have to be adjusted. Sometimes rescheduling or adapting tests could be also very helpful for children. Minimizing or anticipating triggers. If Mother's Day and Father's Day are coming and you're responsible for decorating the school, or you want to tell every child Happy Mother's Day or Father's Day, appreciating that a lot of the children might not have mom or dad in the home because of death or because of ambiguous loss. Appreciate that children's birthdays or the birthday of the family members might cause some problems. So knowing when a child's birthday is, they might not have had a birthday cake. No one might have acknowledged it. Introduce activities in a way that acknowledges absence and loss. Make an effort to reach out to grieving students at school events where the absence of a loved one may be especially noticeable. And be cautious about things about death, war, and violence. Obviously, most schools are sensitive to that, but sometimes we bring discussions of the news and what's going on in the world, and that can be very difficult for children who have a parent who might be a soldier or who might be in jail or incarcerated, etc. It's often hard to know what children are most sensitive to and why they are. Oops. This is a tricky one. If a child loses a parent, oftentimes we encourage school staff to work with children in small groups, and wherever you can get the group in a small group, to help prepare for the children coming back into the class and provide the students with an opportunity to ask questions. Oftentimes this will be based on the family's comfort, letting other children know what's going on in the family. So by accepting the fact that there's a new psychological family, and you could be aware that there's a new psychological family. So if you're doing a call down in the office or you're looking to reach out to the family, it may not be the biological family, it may be the caretaking family, or the children who identifies with that as being that family. You can express support on behalf of the school community to that psychological family, and you can talk with the family about what can be shared with the students and staff, and let the family know that there are resources in the school to support them. Offer them advice. You can have them, and we'll talk about other resources that families can have about how to support their children adjusting to loss, and remind children of this critical time, and families of the critical time and their role in the life of their children to help make sure that they get that security and attachment back, and assist students with transition back to school and get feedback from their families about how the children are doing. Very important. And this slide was really included so everybody remembers that oftentimes with schools, you know what's going on with the kids in your building, but the kids go to another grade or another school and it's all forgotten. Sometimes it's important to work out that network about who drops the children off at school, who has, what's going on with them. So it's really important for us to figure out ways with the family's understanding to help provide more support for the child so that information gets passed from one building and one staff to the next. And again, during times of transition, oftentimes kids get lost in the shuffle, and their losses that they suffer and all that they're going through may be just kind of put aside a little bit, and that can be very disjointing for the children. Coordination is really important to have everybody know what's going on. It occurs not only with the child in the building, having everybody ask the child all the time how they're doing who's going through grief can be very draining. So it's important that everybody get together and talk a little bit about what they're going through and to support interaction. And that usually works out with somebody in the school. It could be the school secretary. It could be somebody who's the monitor in the hallway. It could be whoever the child gravitates to, and that person could be the major contact. But you let everybody know in the school know about what the support needs for that children are. And bringing it all home a little bit before we finish up, things I've touched on in this presentation, no doubt have touched people in this audience and people listening to this webinar. Grief is something we all go through and we all have experiences with, both ambiguous loss, loss that are secondary and also primary loss of people through death that we love. And the impact of this sometimes can cause us to have a lot of pain. So Loie's going to talk a little bit more to the school staff in the audience about professional self-care for you.
Great. So some of the triggers that you may experience in dealing with kids of this population is your own past personal experience with grief and ambiguous loss. If you have personal experience or know people that do, this might touch you in a bit of a different way. If you're coping with a serious illness, it makes you, more vulnerable to hearing a lot of these stories for kids, and so that, may make this work a little bit more difficult. Having a friend or a family member who's currently ill, again, makes you a little bit more vulnerable and makes this stuff a little bit harder to deal with, and having new concerns about loved ones. So maybe it's happening right now, it's happening while you're doing this work, so that's something that's very much on your mind. So some things that you can do, as you can see on the slide, wellness comes in a lot of different capacities, a lot of different ways. So some things you can do, find some support in other people, so identifying friends, family, colleagues, people to talk with, people that you can share stories with so that you get that off of your own shoulders alone. If you need to, seeking additional support when guilt, resentment, or personal grief is strong or persistent. So maybe, talking to friends is not enough, so you can seek additional support for those topics, and also consulting with your school counselor, school nurse, school psychologist, school social worker, or other members of the school staff who may be able to give you a little bit more information, to talk with you about your own personal feelings about doing this work, and help to support you in being a strong presence for these kids.
And children are amazing in their capacity to know when we're distracted, when something's bothering us, if we're looking down when they see us, or if we don't look like we're connecting to them. They pick it up pretty quickly. So although we think we're good maskers of a lot of our feelings, kids really see it really well, and I think it's an opportune lesson time to teach them a little bit about how you're coping. It was sad to hear about the loss, and I'm going through some sadness, but I'm working to cope with it. To tell them a little bit about how you deal with it can go a long way. Again, kids learn a lot from adults, and it may not necessarily be the school guidance counselor. Oftentimes, it's people that they have more contact with, and people in the audience know that the child may come to you more than they would to the school psychologist, the school nurse. They've come to wherever they feel close to, whatever reason. We also know that kids oftentimes will only reach out once or twice to somebody. They won't keep reaching out. And that's why it's important for us to take that first step and to realize that we don't need to be a person who's without feelings, but we certainly can teach the children a great deal by our own professional self-care. Now, I mentioned the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. It's the group that pretty much has been working around the United States and providing support to schools in crisis. Most recently, we've been out in Las Vegas. We've been to Aurora. We've been to anywhere in the United States where there's been a school shooting or school violence or disruptive school incident, including Newtown. We'll be there to try to help support the schools, every member of the school, deal with what's going on, helping them sort things out. So we have this special website that I just wanted to help you navigate through, that if you need information, there's material that can be used for schools experiencing crisis or helping students now. And there's also a number that can be called toll-free, and this is all, again, free service and free consultation. And we can guide schools about how they can deal with a grieving situation in the school, and also help them prepare if they want to get ready to become a grief-sensitive school. So on the National Center's website are all that content and material that's all free that you can download. The special website, too, that was just created with NEA as one of the founding members is grievingstudents.org. And what happens on the website, there's 6 different topic areas with video modules that are free and downloadable, and also handouts that you can look to if you want to figure out, for example, how to talk to children, what to say, what not to say, providing support over time, peer support. There's handouts and videos of actually grieving children and school staff talking about that. And there's also links to additional resources. We also have PowerPoint trainings that you can download if you want to go through the whole training yourself or show them to other people in your school that are available for download on the website too. We did this because we heard from school staff that they wanted information that was easily accessible when they needed it. They don't want to go watch a lot of different things. They wanted modules they can pick, come back to, look at, download. Some people like to read. Some people like to look at videos. So it's a really user-friendly website, and it's free. And again, it has all the stuff that everybody agrees on. I know that's hard sometimes that everybody comes to some consensus, but it's all there, and we're very proud of that. And we also have practical issues that are covered too, things like funeral attendance, how to do memorials in school, how to deal with suicide, how to deal with the death of a teacher or the death of someone in the school community. So all that is included. So when you need those topics, they're all there. And again, if you need specific questions answered that may be unique to your school, the National Center for School Crisis Bereavement phone numbers or email. We usually get back to you right away, either through email or we'll give a call, and we can walk you through how to get help for yourself in a situation where it becomes quite challenging. The other resource that's available is after a loved one dies. Parents can download it actually from childandgrief.com. It was sponsored by the New York Life Foundation, which is one of the originator supporters of the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. That's free, and you can also order copies for your school if you want to give them out to families. And that material fits very well with the content that was developed for schools. So at childandgrief.com, it's a great handout. It's available in different languages that you can download. You can order copies, and that fits in very well with the Coalition to Support Grieving Students material. The other one, if those of you guys like to read a book, the Grieving Student and Teacher's Guide, is more geared for teachers in classrooms, but it's still another resource if people need that and want to look at that. That's another resource that's available. And if you need references that were used in this presentation, we can certainly send them to you. If you need any more questions, you can certainly call the National Center or email us, and we'll be happy to do it, either myself or Dr. David Schoenfeld. He's the director of the center. We personally get back to you, and we try to get answers to your question. And we will be moving to the Q&A portion quickly. And it's great that you're hanging in here. Thanks for all you guys are staying on the call. Again, it's important to know that we're not just talking about grieving children because of grief due to death. We're also dealing with kids who have ambiguous loss and children who have other losses. And we see them all the time. And again, kids will reach out to everybody in the school. The goal of the Coalition to Support Grieving Children's curriculum was we wanted everybody in the school, from the person who meets them on the bus, to the person who helps them check in the morning, to the person who brings them to gym class, to the gym teacher, everybody. We want everybody to know the same stuff because I think kids need to hear the uniform voice. And that's why it was so important to develop this set curriculum. And that's why the material from this presentation and all the content is available for download, and there's videos available. So at this point in time, I want to encourage you guys, if you have questions, we'd be happy to answer those questions for you. Again, it was a lot to cover, and thank you guys for hanging on the line here. Again, we're here to really address whatever questions you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Demaria, for that informative presentation on how education support professionals can create a school climate where children are able to talk about their losses and receive the needed support by the whole school community. I see some people typing. Well, I saw someone typing and stopped, so we'll give you guys, okay, multiple attendees are typing. So we'll give them a few minutes to type in and see if we have any questions for you.
Again, while people are typing, there was a question about sharing of information. It's a great question. Again, while people are typing, there was a question about sharing of information. It's a great question. Oftentimes related to that, I found when I work with children, a lot of people want to tell a child, for example, sorry for your loss. A lot of children find that off-putting because you really don't know their loss. You don't know what they're going through. And I find that better to say to the children is, I've heard you've gone through something very upsetting. I've kind of went through something a little bit like that myself, but I want to know how it feels like for you. I find that's a more gentler way, and most kids will respond to it. Again, if you go to a wake, or if you go to a Shiva call, or wherever you're greeting a child in whatever format, having children know that you're ready to listen to them and you're ready to hear them can be really very helpful for kids. The question that came up is, how long has the Coalition of Grieving Students been around? It's a great question because it's about 2 years old, and it took about 2 years before that to get it going. So I've been involved in the Coalition to Support Grieving Students about 4 years. Since that time, we've been using the curriculum throughout the United States, and we've been having people really comment on it. If there is a topic that you feel we need to develop, for example, we just developed topics for military families, for police officers who were killed in the line of duty. But if there's another special group of children that you feel we need to cover more or more specially, it might be helpful to talk about that also. Please let us know. The question came up about groups to help the children facing loss. What's tough about grief is that children won't all grieve at the same time. Oftentimes, groups can be very helpful if the children experience a similar loss. For example, if it's an act of violence or children are in a neighborhood where a loss happens. The problem with putting children in a group, depending on the age and depending on the facilitators, is the children sometimes can let other children talk and not them talk about their feelings, or children may agree that that's what they're going through and it's not really what happens to them. So small groups are very good, especially if it's a common experience. It's good to help talk about grief in general, but sometimes it could be difficult and some of the children may not want to talk. We always encourage schools, if they can, to use small groups and not to have large assemblies after a major loss, because oftentimes children will sometimes piggyback on what other kids are doing and not necessarily talk about their own intimate feelings. The question came up about how long ago the first support system of grieving students came about. The Coalition to Support Grieving Students was about 2 years ago. That's when we got the content and material about. The grief field has been out for a while. The National Alliance of Grieving Children is it's a professional organization that has grief-related organizations throughout the United States. And certainly they're a great resource if you need to send people to a place or children to a place where they can get grief support. The grieving content from the Coalition to Support Grieving Students is fairly recent. The National Center, the School Crisis Bereavement, was formed right after 9/11. That's when Dr. Schoenfeld came up with the idea that we really needed a more in-place system to help children and schools and school staff manage grief and support grieving children. However, grieving children we find still get ignored. We find that oftentimes after a violent episode, the violence is attended to, but sometimes the grief is forgotten, and kids can have grief for years, both at primary and secondary loss. And sadly, the ambiguous loss, which we touched on in this presentation, oftentimes is not covered also. So we really want you guys to become champions to support children who have ambiguous loss, the loss that's not really as accessible. Another question came up that our high school had a suicide 2 years ago. Is it too long to check in? Is it worse to bring it up? Great question Amy brought up. Oftentimes schools feel that if you bring something up, it's going to cause it to come up again. And what we find is it's there anyway. And if it doesn't come up, sometimes children, because of the distress caused by a suicide or by something bad happening, may act out on it or may do things that are untoward about it. So we encourage to check in, to talk with people in terms of what's going on, to get a pulse by talking to individual students about how is that death due to suicide, And it's important to call it that because suicide is often caused by emotional illness or chemical addiction. It's an irrational act. It's not a bad thing to check in to see what the long-lasting impact of it. Sometimes children who've been exposed to a death by suicide feel that their lives are marked and can feel like that their lives are not going on the same way. And I think it's good to see whether their development has been changed in some way. So I would encourage you to keep bringing up. The next question is resources for working with children of color. It's a really, really important question. It's one of the things we're looking to work on also at the center to help people understand that when working with children of color or children from a different group, to make sure that they're sensitive and aware of cultural traditions and also special needs with those families. So that's something we're developing right now, and hopefully we'll add that to the website soon. So if you email me at the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, we can let you know when those handouts are going to become available.
Okay, it looks.
Oh, thank you. Some very nice comments about people who acknowledge the fact that grief is often forgotten. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge grief and we don't treat it like it's something that's unusual. It's something that's such a common part of children's lives, but it's also such a sad part when we don't pay attention to it. And people will pay attention to death loss for a little while, but we oftentimes do forget the long-lasting impact. But we oftentimes do forget the ambiguous loss, the children whose parents, as I mentioned, who are divorced, or the children going through situations where the parents are there but not there, like parents in jail or parents who are substance abusers. All those children are grieving too, and they need that support. And I think it's very important that we all remember that. Thank you for those nice comments. What was brought up by Amy was about that grief is the elephant in the room, and how are you today, because it was less overwhelming, was the suggestion about how this one person in an article talked about. But I think it does make sense. Oftentimes, grief could be the topic we don't talk about, but it's there. And I think by not talking about it, you send a message to children that it's not important. And you don't have to ask prying questions. You can say, like, how are you today? How is it going? But acknowledge, I heard Mom is not home with you guys. How are you doing? How's your family doing? Can we help you in any way? I think validation of an experience and letting people know that you know can be so reinforcing and supporting and help children feel that, again, it's not something they need to be ashamed about. I think not talking oftentimes leads to shame with children. And again, feelings are very important because oftentimes if you don't attend to a feeling when they think you know what's going on, it gives the children a message that they don't need to take those feelings anywhere. The question was about undocumented students or students who are maybe concerned about their legal status. And it's really difficult because sometimes students do fear retribution by talking about mom or dad is not here or where mom and dad is, and they'll be very vague. Remember I talked about as oftentimes in families there's an ambiguity. And sometimes telling children that we're here to support you in any way we can. If you'd like to share a little bit about what you can in a safe way, we'll try to do that. But acknowledging the fact that it might be hard and they might be afraid of certain things. And I think it's important to have that sensitivity that sometimes sharing might be frightening for them. Or they might have been told by their family, don't tell anybody anything about the family. So sometimes if there's a special situation, they may feel they're betraying the family to share. But if you see they're upset, maybe you can not ask what's going on and maybe give the child permission. You don't need to tell me what's going on. Just tell me how you're feeling today. It looks like you're feeling a little sad. Well, how can I help support you in your sadness, or how can I help support you because you look a little afraid today? And respecting the fact that they might not want to disclose because they are talking. They've been told not to talk about it. Somebody else suggested that sometimes drawing or writing assignment. Yeah, creative ways are great ways for kids to sometimes share and talk about things. I think sometimes we're very verbally oriented. We want people to share and talk and answer questions, but sometimes you can ask a child to tell me, would you like to draw a picture about how you're feeling today, or would you like to write a little story about what's going on, or could you show me in a picture about how you're feeling? Yeah, using creative art is really wonderful to help children express themselves. Another person shared, Judy, that they have a child who has autism and mental illness. Her parents are recently divorced and suffer from many of their own problems. This child is clearly engaged but expresses itself violently and aggressively towards peers and adults. It is hard to address all of her needs, but the grief she feels must be acknowledged. I agree that oftentimes, again, kids who can't speak or can't communicate do externalize this loss. Attachment is such a fundamental part of the human condition, and feeling connected with people is so important. And a disrupted attachment, particularly with a child who suffers because of their own impairments, makes it so trying and so frustrating. So understanding that the child might be frustrated about the attachment and grief issues that they're feeling, and somehow acknowledging that to the child in some way at a level the child can understand might help the child feel that they don't need to express themselves that way when that inner pain is there. I think a lot of children who go through troubled situations who become violent oftentimes are struggling with loss and abandonment. A question came up about students who are anticipating loss, such as when a parent is ill or dying. It's really hard because we think that the children are preparing for the death or they're preparing for the departure, but anybody in the audience who knows, who's lost someone that they love, you can never really be fully prepared because the children don't have a concept of really what it means to have that loss. So helping the child deal with the ambiguous loss of a parent who's sick and may not be available may be the most important thing you can do, and acknowledge that. It's hard to have mommy there or daddy there, but knowing that they're not there all the time, maybe that's one way to help them. And then be attentive to them to know that even though mom or dad might have been sick for a while and then dies, sadly, it doesn't necessarily de-intensify the severity or the intensity of the grief.
So this will officially conclude the question and answer portion of the webinar. Thank you so much for your active participation throughout the session. On your screen right now, you will see email addresses for myself as well as Dr. Demaria. If you have any questions regarding this presentation that you would like to email him, please feel free to do so. And thank you, everyone, once again for your participation in today's session. Please be sure to visit www.nea.org/ESPPD to stay up to date with both recorded and upcoming webinar sessions. Thank you and have a good evening.